Okay, I am here at the Lutheran Seminary Complex, and today we're going to talk about a little known piece of Gettysburg history. Anytime you involve yourself in the study of the Battle of Gettysburg, there's a lot of whys. Why didn't Mule take that hill? What caused the Union Army to crumble on the first day? How did the Union Army eventually win the battle when it seemed like on the first day they were being routed? What saved them? And a lot of times you hear about different regiments or different officers from that battle. This officer did this regiment protected the retreat, and sacrificed themselves. And a lot of times it's the infantry, it's the artillery, it's the cavalry, it's a certain officer. But often the civilian and the lesser known army personnel are left behind to history. And one such story that was first published in the Milwaukee Sunday Telegraph on July 30th, 1882, talks about a specific heroic action that took place here on the Gettysburg battlefield in this area on July 1st, 1863. And it was later called by General Hancock himself the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg. So this is going to be the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 1. And this is the story of a man named Jerome A. Waltrus. And Jerome A. Waltrus was detached. He was a sergeant that was detached with the 6th Wisconsin, and he was in charge of an ammunition train. And here on July 1st, 1863, while back in the town of Gettysburg, he heard about the morning rout of troops over in this area under in the First Corps under Reynolds. Reynolds was killed. Wadsworth's and Meredith's and Cutler's brigades were being torn up here just west of town by overwhelming numbers of Confederate troops. And by mid-afternoon, the situation became drastic when Union soldiers, and more specifically Union soldiers of the Iron Brigade, started to run near empty on ammunition. Now, at this point, these soldiers were probably beaten. They were being pushed back, and they would eventually be pushed back through the town. However, while being pushed back through the town, if they would have ran out of ammunition totally, they probably would have been destroyed, and the Confederates could have routed the Union soldiers here before giving them the opportunity to entrench themselves on the high ground back at Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And Jerome A. Waltrus, who was detached with the 6th Wisconsin, volunteered to take a 10-team mule wagon train filled with ammunition and distribute it, after receiving an order, distribute it to troops in this area on July 1st, 1863. And that's what this story is going to be about. This has been the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 1, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 2. And by noon of July 1st, 1863, the Union Army had been in deep trouble. The First Corps, fighting over here near Herbst Woods, was in deep trouble as their ammunition began to run out. Their commanding officer, John Fulton Reynolds, had been killed about an hour before, and Confederate troops advancing from the west and from the north of town began pushing back both the 11th and the First Corps. Waltrus returned to his train, and not too long after that, a staff officer under 1st Division Commander Wadsworth came to him and told him that they needed ammunition as quickly as possible. Now, Jerome Waltrus went along the line of drivers And he found a driver from the 7th Wisconsin named Bert, and he told him that he wanted him and his team to the front. And Bert, with 9 other wagons, began their charge with their wagon train out into this area. They passed by the Lutheran Theological seminary rather, just to the right side of the building there, where you see Valentine Hall, and then proceeded down this direction where you see the modern buildings today, and then of course the YWCA and that modern house there. Their wagon train came into this area, and this is where they first came among the battle lines of July 1st, 1863. Now, the roads that were leading up to this point were very good, and the order that were given down to each driver was to keep the mules running, and do not stop until the specific order had been given to do so. The train passed through the northwest into town and then came here into the Lutheran Theological Seminary when it finally came down into the battle line. Now, when Jerome Walters came here, a major came out to him and said, "Stop that wagon or it's going to become captured." And Jerome Walters had already received his orders from Wadsworth telling him to get ammunition out here as soon as possible. So, of course, he shook off that officer, that major, and told him that I have received orders to deliver the ammunition, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And before long, his wagon was out in the open field just behind Union lines, and we're going to take over there in part 3, just in the distance where you see the Herbst Woods, the clearing between Herbst Woods and the McPherson barn, not too far from the spot where John Fulton Reynolds was killed, most likely just an hour before this wagon train arrived. This has been the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, part 2, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, part 3. And we had just left off at a point of chaos. Jerome A. Walters passed the Lutheran Theological Seminary, headed in this direction. John Reynolds, 1st Corps commanders, killed here about an hour before. Brigadier General Abner Doubleday is now in command. Union troops from the 1st Corps defending this area, and from the 11th Corps defending an area north of town, are beginning to be routed by Confederate troops, and they're running out of ammunition. An order is given to bring ammunition to the front as soon as possible. Jerome A. Walters obeys that order, has a team of 10 wagon trains headed in this area when he's stopped by a major and ordered to stop or his wagon train will be captured. But be given the order, he ignores that and comes out, and he's into this area here. We are here right along Herbst Woods, not far from the spot in the direction over here where John F. Reynolds was just killed. We're about out in the middle of the field on the south side of the McPherson barn. And just above us, the ridge that you see, at that point in the battle, the fighting with the Iron Brigade, back and forth in this area. The wagon train arrives in this area here in the open fields just beyond the Lutheran Seminary building, and it was under fire of about 12 Confederate artillery pieces, probably several of them from Pegram's artillery, which was about a half a mile in front of us. The wagons come into this area just behind Union lines, and they form a semicircle, and then finally order comes to stop, and they stop. And workers in the back of the wagons, other teamsters, begin tumbling boxes of ammunition off of these wagons onto the ground behind the Union lines. Now, Jerome A. Walters, who had jumped off the wagon just a little bit in the distance, was running behind those wagons with an axe in his hand, and he began to get these boxes that were being tumbled off the wagons and split them open, making it even easier for Federal soldiers of the Iron Brigade to get to the ammunition. They had around 75,000 rounds on these 10 wagons, which they were able to get most of them off onto the ground and split open in this area. And that's the truly heroic action of Waltrus and his team here, that they were able to come here under fire, get these wagons being shot at by shot and shell close enough to Union lines, and even distribute and break open the boxes so that this ammunition could be distributed. Men who were running out of ammunition near the end, to get them approximately 60 rounds per man, which would show to be sufficient enough to allow them to hold back as long as possible the Confederate advance in this area, long enough for the next federal commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, and his Second Corps to arrive and bolster the heights on the town, and then take over as the commanding officer here until General Meade can arrive himself. An order had been given for Hancock to take over as soon as he arrived on the battlefield. So this action by Waltrus and his team here bought a very, very valuable time for these federal soldiers back at East Cemetery Hill to bolster that line. It bought time for Winfield Scott Hancock to arrive, and it also purchased valuable time for soldiers of the 1st and 11th Corps who began retreating here. At this point, Waltrus, after distributing most of the ammunitions, began to order his wagons back in town, and the way he did that was he pointed in the distance at the Chambersburg Pike, and we'll take over there on our next video series. This has been the Mule wagon charge at Gettysburg, Part 3, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Mule train charge at Gettysburg, Part 4. And I am standing here just east of the McPherson Barn along the Chambersburg Pike in the historic peach orchard in which General Lee made his headquarters on July 1st, 1863, near that upright cannon there. His headquarters were actually in this peach orchard. The Mary Thompson House is nearby. That is the unofficial spot of these headquarters. Now, when Jerome Walters, we left off, he had distributed as much of the 75,000 rounds of ammunition as possible. He came under artillery fire and ordered his men to head back toward the town. And the order that he gave was that the soldiers in these wagon trains should give the rest of the ammunition to any Union soldier that needed it from this point on. So they were just to toss them out as regiments were passing by, seeing ammunition trains. If any commanders would come up and say, our men need ammunition, they were to dump the boxes off onto the ground and distribute it as seen fit. Just as the wagon train left the McPherson Barn area and headed in the direction of this peach orchard here along the Chambersburg Pike, it came under heavy artillery fire. And one of the things that took place during that retreat of the wagon train was that some of the mules were killed. There was one such instance by a driver named Indiana where he began riding away, and his mule had both hind legs shot right off. And as the mule landed stumps on the ground, the shock on the driver's face was that a couple other teamsters that were in the wagon unfortunately had to unhitch the animal and shoot it to put it out of its misery. Other animals were also, there was another mule that was shot and mortally wounded and also was put down here, and then one of the wagons had its wheel shot off as well. So at this point, headed in the direction toward where our camera facing, Waltrus and whatever wagons he could get out of here began heading back into town. Now, one of General Wadsworth's staff officers watched all this action that we just talked about in the last couple parts in amazement and witnessed it. And he would later put it in a battle report. Now, when Waltrus got back into the town, the town began getting crowded with fleeing soldiers. And they turned toward the right where the 11th Corps was falling back into the town in disarray and order. Now, the Confederates were so close behind them that Federal officers were firing their revolvers at them. O'Connor stood in the wagon bed to fire his revolver, and finally a New York regiment finally drove some Confederates backwards. Now, when they finally reached the rallying point back on Cemetery Hill, Major Winfield Scott Hancock had the orders in his hand to take over command of the army, and that was from Major Reynolds. When Waltrus and his wagons finally reached that point, a man walked up to him after Waltrus had just moments before that seen General Oliver Howard. He was sitting upon his horse, and he wrote later that he was sitting upon his horse as if he was watching a 4th of July parade. Well, a man walks up to Waltrus and he says to him, "Good God, what have you got here? What have you got a wagon here for? You haven't been into action." And Jerome Waltrus nodded back at him and he said, "Yes, sir, I just came back with the rear guard." And then finally the man says, "Well, did you lose all your ammunition?" And Waltrus answered to him, "No, sir, I distributed nearly all of it." He said, "Well, did you lose any of your wagons?" And he goes, "Well, I got back with some of them." And then finally this man, General Winfield Scott Hancock, nodded at him and smiled. And he said to him, "Good, but it is the first mule train charge that I've ever knew anything about. You did well, Sergeant. Move your wagons down beyond here into safe territory and report to me in a half an hour." So Jerome A. Waltrus sees General Howard, and then actually meets and talks to Winfield Scott Hancock just about the time he arrives here on the battlefield. And after the war, he would always, when he would speak at veterans engagements, he would always remember that conversation and that one instance that he met General Winfield Scott Hancock, and how Hancock commended him on his mule train charge here at Gettysburg. A good point of reference for this would be, if for any of you genealogists, you can go back and search through the records of the Milwaukee Sunday Telegraph from July 30th, 1882. That's probably the first time that story is being publicly talked about, in 1882. At the time, Waltrus would actually go on to live about another 40 years and die. I think it was 1922. He was born in 1840, and he lived till 1922. So at 1882, he was only about halfway through his life. So this is the story of the mule train charge at Gettysburg with Jerome A. Waltrus, detached from the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.